The river does not remember the names of the men who built its first embankments, yet it carries the rhythm of their lives in every silt-heavy surge of its current. Even now, as the water of the Indus winds through the parched reaches of the modern landscape, it speaks in a low, rhythmic murmur, a sound that has remained unchanged for over 5,000 years. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghost of a world that once thrived along these banks, a civilization that rose from the earth with a precision that defies the chaos of the ancient world. This is the Harappan civilization, a ghost of the Bronze Age, a society that mastered the art of living together in vast, orderly cities, while the rest of the world was still struggling to define the very concept of a street. It is a land of profound silence, not for a lack of life, but for a lack of a voice we can understand. In the dust of the Indus Valley, we find the most sophisticated urban planning of the third millennium before the Common Era. Neighborhoods laid out on perfect grids, advanced drainage systems that carried waste away from the home, and granaries so large they suggest a wealth beyond imagining. And yet, amidst this architectural perfection, there is a void. Unlike the Egyptians with their towering hieroglyphs or the Mesopotamians with their cuneiform tablets, the people of the Indus left behind no epic poems, no king lists, and no recorded laws that we can read today. They are a civilization of symbols we cannot translate, a culture that speaks to us in a script that remains stubbornly, hauntingly silent. As we begin our journey into this forgotten world, drifting back through the layers of time, we must prepare ourselves for a mystery that has no easy resolution. History is often written by the victors, but here it seems history was written in a language that the earth itself decided to keep secret. Before we descend further into the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and the brick-lined streets of Harappa, I want to take a moment to acknowledge those of you who are settling in for the night. You have found your way to the Slumber Archives, and it is a pleasure to have you with us. We share new history narrations, just like this one every single day, crafted to help you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep. So if you find this journey relaxing, please consider subscribing so you never miss a nightly story. A simple like also helps other weary travelers find their way to our fireside. Now, let us return to the quiet banks of the river, where the secrets of the past are buried deep beneath the sand. The scale of the Indus Valley Civilization is difficult to grasp when one considers how long it remained hidden from the modern eye. It stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, reaching from the foothills of the Himalayas to the shores of the Arabian Sea. It was a world of trade and craft, where merchants moved carnelian beads and copper tools across vast distances. But as we walk through the reconstructed ruins in our minds, we are struck by a strange paradox. In almost every other early civilization, the landscape is dominated by the ego, by massive temples to angry gods or grand palaces built to satisfy the vanity of kings. In the Indus, we find no such things. There are no obvious palaces. There are no monumental statues of conquerors. Instead, we find a society that seems to have valued the collective over the individual, a place where the most impressive structures were not tombs for the dead, but great baths for the living. This lack of central glorification makes the absence of their writing even more frustrating for the modern historian. We have found thousands of small, square seals carved from steatite, a soft stone that hardens when fired. On these seals, we see beautiful, delicate carvings of animals. The powerful humped bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, and most famously, a creature that looks like a unicorn. Above these animals sits a row of characters, elegant, geometric, and tantalizingly brief. There are roughly 400 unique signs in the Indus script, usually appearing in groups of 5 or 6. For over a century, the greatest minds in linguistics and archaeology have stared at these symbols, trying to find a bridge to the past. They have used statistical models and compared them to every known language family, yet the script refuses to yield its meaning. It is as if the Harappans are standing just behind a veil of frosted glass. We can see the shape of their lives, we can see the order of their cities, but we cannot hear the sound of their names. As the years passed and archaeology moved into the modern era, our tools for looking into the past became more refined. We began to use radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us exactly how many thousands of years have passed since a piece of charcoal was burned or a grain of wheat was harvested. We used stratigraphy, the study of the layers of the earth, where each foot of soil represents a century of human struggle and triumph. Through these methods, we realized that the Indus civilization did not just appear out of thin air. It was the result of a long, slow climb toward complexity. But even with our most advanced science, the why of their silence remains. Did they write on perishable materials like palm leaves or cloth that rotted away in the humid river air? Or was their script used only for accounting and trade, a utilitarian tool that never felt the need to record the yearnings of the soul? The mystery deepens when we consider the sheer uniformity of their world. From one end of the valley to the other, the bricks used to build their homes were made in a standard ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. Their weights and measures were so precise and so universal that a merchant in the north would have used the exact same scale as a merchant in the south. This level of standardization suggests a powerful, perhaps even bureaucratic, central authority. And yet, without a deciphered script, we cannot know who issued these orders. We do not know the names of their governors, the titles of their priests, or the words of their songs. They are a society defined by their actions rather than their words, a people who left us a perfectly functioning machine of a city, but took the manual with them when they departed. Meanwhile, the environment they lived in was a constant shifting presence. The Indus River is a temperamental god. It provides life-giving silt, but it is also prone to devastating floods that can change the course of the water by miles in a single season. The Harappans learned to live with this instability, building their cities on massive raised platforms of sun-dried brick to stay above the rising tides. They were a people of the water, and perhaps it is fitting that so much of their story has been washed away by time. As we settle deeper into the evening, we might imagine ourselves standing on the ramparts of a city like Mohenjo-Daro, 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. The air is warm and carries the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Below us, the streets are quiet. The drain covers are neatly in place, and in 1,000 small rooms, people are finishing their evening meals. They are surrounded by a script they can read as easily as we read these words, a script that tells them who they are and where they belong. It is a humbling thought to realize that an entire world, as vibrant and complex as our own, can simply vanish into the silence of the soil. We often think of progress as a steady climb, an accumulation of knowledge that is passed down from one generation to the next. But the Indus Valley reminds us that history is fragile. It is a tapestry that can be unraveled by a change in the weather, a shift in a river's path, or the simple passage of deep time. As we continue this journey through the silent valley, we will look at the clues they did leave behind, the pottery, the jewelry, and the strange, haunting seals, and we will try to piece together the identity of a people who built a paradise of order, only to leave us wondering who they were and what they might have said if they had only left us a key to their voice. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a shovel striking sun-hardened earth, not the metallic clang we might expect today, but a dull, heavy thud that echoes across a landscape where time itself seems to have stalled. For thousands of years, the plains of Punjab and Sindh held their breath, keeping a secret beneath the silt of the Indus River, while the world above moved on, oblivious to the ghosts beneath its feet. It was the year 1921, a time when the British Raj stretched its influence across the subcontinent, and the earth finally decided to yield. In the heat of that year, an Indian archaeologist named Daya Ram Sahni stood atop a massive, wind-swept mound in Harappa. To the casual observer, it was merely a hill of debris, a strange interruption in the flat horizon, perhaps nothing more than the ruins of a medieval fort or a forgotten outpost. But as Sahni began to dig, he found something that defied the logic of the local history. He unearthed bricks, thousands upon thousands of them fired to a precise, uniform hardness that felt almost modern. These were not the crude, sun-dried mud blocks of a simple village, but the structural bones of something far more sophisticated. As he delved deeper, the earth began to give up its treasures, tiny, exquisite seals carved from soapstone, depicting strange animals and a script that no one living could read. At first, there was a sense of profound confusion. The prevailing wisdom of the time suggested that urban civilization in India had begun much later, perhaps around the time of Alexander the Great or the rise of the Mauryan Empire. Sahni and his colleagues initially wondered if they had stumbled upon a cluster of ancient Buddhist monasteries, perhaps dating back only 2,000 years. The mounds were so vast, and their contents so alien to the known record, that the mind naturally reached for the familiar to explain the impossible. Meanwhile, 400 miles to the south, in the arid province of Sindh, another archaeologist named R.D. Banerjee was exploring a site known by the locals as Mohenjo-Daro, a name that translates, chillingly, to the Mound of the Dead. Banerjee was also searching for Buddhist relics, specifically a stupa that sat atop the highest point of the ruins. But as he scraped away the layers of dust and debris, he realized that the Buddhist structure was merely a latecomer, a shallow footprint left on top of a giant. Beneath the stupa lay a city of such immense proportions and complexity that it seemed to have dropped out of the sky. It was a moment of profound realization that must have felt like a sudden shift in the gravity of history. As Sahni and Banerjee compared their findings, the truth began to crystallize. They weren't looking at isolated ruins or minor settlements. They were looking at the twin capitals of a lost world. The sheer scale of these mounds, rising like sleeping leviathans from the plains, spoke of a population in the tens of thousands, a society that had mastered the art of the city long before the foundations of Rome were even a thought. The discovery sent a shockwave through the global scientific community. Before 1921, the story of human civilization was a two-part harmony, centered on the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia and the emerald banks of the Nile. We knew of the pyramids, and we knew of the ziggurats of Ur, but the Indus Valley was a blank space on the map of our collective past. Suddenly, a third great civilization had emerged from the shadows, sitting as an equal alongside Egypt and Sumer. This wasn't just a new chapter in a book, it was an entire volume that had been misplaced for nearly 4 millennia. The antiquity of the site was confirmed through the study of stratigraphy, the method of reading the layers of the earth like the pages of a diary. The deeper they went, the further back they travelled into deep time. They realized that while the Egyptians were perfecting the art of mummification and the Sumerians were scratching cuneiform into clay, the people of the Indus were building cities with grid-patterned streets, underground drainage systems, and multi-story houses. It was a realization that humbled the modern world, reminding us that progress is not always a straight line, and that greatness can be utterly forgotten if the winds of time blow hard enough. As the excavations expanded, the mystery only deepened. There were no great temples to terrifying gods, no sprawling palaces for vainglorious kings, and no monuments to bloody conquests. Instead, there was order. There was a quiet, pervasive sense of planning that suggested a people who valued the collective over the individual. The mounds of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were not just piles of dirt and brick. They were the silent monuments of a civilization that had mastered the environment of the river valley, turning the seasonal floods into a source of life and wealth. One can only imagine the thoughts of the explorers as they walked through the newly cleared streets of Mohenjo-Daro, brushing away the dust of 4,000 years. They were walking through a ghost town where the ghosts had no names. They found jewelry made of gold and carnelian, delicate pottery painted with geometric designs, and children's toys, small clay carts and whistles that suggested a life not so different from our own. And yet, there was a heavy, palpable silence. Unlike the Egyptians, who covered their walls in hieroglyphs telling stories of their lives and their journey into the afterlife, the Indus people left no murals, no epic poems, and no king lists. The realization of what had been found brought with it a sense of bittersweet wonder. A third pillar of the ancient world had been restored to its rightful place, but it was a pillar wrapped in fog. The scale of the discovery was so vast that it redefined the history of the entire Asian continent, pushing the origins of settled urban life back by thousands of years. It challenged the notion that the West was the sole cradle of organized society and forced a reimagining of how humans first learned to live together in peace and prosperity. And so, the world watched as the dust was cleared from the great bath and the granaries, marveling at the technical skill of a people who had disappeared so completely that even their neighbors had forgotten they ever existed. The mounds stood as silent witnesses to a golden age that had thrived for centuries before succumbing to a fate we are still trying to understand. As the sun set over the excavations in those early years, the long shadows of the ruins seemed to point toward a truth that remained just out of reach, a truth buried not just under the earth, but within the very silence of the stones themselves. The awakening of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro was more than just an archaeological breakthrough. It was a confrontation with the limits of our own knowledge. It reminded us that for every city we remember, there may be 10 that we have forgotten, and for every voice that reaches us through the ages, there are 1,000,000 others that have been swallowed by the wind. The discovery was the beginning of a long, patient quest to hear what these silent cities had to say, a quest that continues to this day as we sift through the silt and the sand, looking for a single word that might finally break the silence of the Indus. Imagine a single brick, heavy, rectangular, and fired in the kiln to a deep, earthy red. If you were to hold this brick in your hand, you would find it possesses a curious, mathematical satisfaction. It follows a strict ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. Its width is twice its thickness, and its length is twice its width. This may seem like a small, perhaps even mundane detail, yet this specific proportion is found in every ruin across the vast expanse of the Indus Valley, stretching over hundreds of thousands of square miles from the foothills of the Himalayas to the shores of the Arabian Sea. In an era when most of the world was living in haphazard clusters of mud huts, the people of the Indus were building with a precision that borders on the obsessive. While the great cities of Mesopotamia, like Ur or Uruk, grew organically, their streets twisting and turning like the roots of an ancient tree, narrow alleys winding into dead ends and crowded courtyards. The cities of the Indus were born from a different philosophy. They did not grow. They were designed. They were conceived in their entirety before a single stone was ever laid. As you walk through the ghost streets of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa in your mind's eye, you notice the uncanny order of it all. The main avenues are wide and straight, cutting through the landscape with the confidence of a modern metropolis. They are oriented precisely north to south and east to west, creating a perfect grid that captures the wind to provide a natural, cooling ventilation through the dwellings. There is a profound stillness in this geometry, a sense that every corner, every wall, and every drain was placed with a deliberate purpose, that we are only beginning to grasp. This level of standardization suggests a central authority that is almost impossible to fathom for a civilization 4,000 years old. Whether you were in a small village on the outskirts of the desert or in the heart of a massive urban center, the bricks were the same. The weights and measures used in the markets were identical. The very fabric of life was regulated by a silent, invisible hand. And yet, as we look for the source of this order, we find a void. There are no towering statues of kings, no grand inscriptions boasting of a pharaoh's conquests, and no lavish palaces filled with golden trinkets. The authority of the Indus did not announce itself with fanfare. It expressed itself through the quiet perfection of the infrastructure. In every major city, the layout follows a consistent dual structure that speaks volumes about their social order, even if we cannot yet read their words. To the west, built upon a massive artificial platform of mud, brick, and earth, sits the citadel. This was the high ground, a fortified space that loomed over the rest of the city. For a long time, archaeologists assumed these were fortresses meant for war. But as they dug deeper, they found no evidence of weapons, no barracks for soldiers, and no signs of violent siege. Instead, they found great public baths, massive granaries for storing the communal wealth of the harvest, and assembly halls where perhaps the elders gathered to discuss the turning of the seasons. Below the citadel lay the lower town, a sprawling residential area where the artisans, the traders, and the laborers lived their lives. But even here in the common quarters, the standard of living was remarkably high. The houses were built with thick walls to keep out the blistering heat of the sun, and almost every home, no matter how humble, had its own private bathing area and a sophisticated drainage system that led to covered sewers in the streets. It is a humbling thought to realize that these people enjoyed a level of sanitation that would not be seen again in the world for several millennia. The contrast with contemporary Mesopotamia is striking. In the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the cities were monuments to the ego of the gods and their earthly representatives. The temples were the center of the world, and the streets were often choked with the refuse of a rapidly growing, disorganized population. But in the Indus, the focus seems to have been on the collective, on the flow of water, the storage of grain, and the maintenance of a peaceful, predictable order. It was a civilization that valued the grid over the monument, and the common good over the individual's glory. One cannot help but wonder what kind of mind conceived of such a place. To maintain such rigid standards across such a vast territory requires more than just a set of rules. It requires a shared vision, a common language of architecture and existence that permeated every level of society. As we trace the straight lines of their streets through the dust of time, we are looking at the blueprint of a utopia that actually existed, a place where the chaos of nature was tamed not by force, but by the quiet application of mathematics and logic. And yet, for all this planning, for all this incredible foresight, the people of the Indus remains a mystery. They left behind the most organized cities of the ancient world, but they did not leave us their names. They left us the most advanced plumbing of the Bronze Age, but no stories of their heroes. They left us a world of perfect right angles and standardized bricks, a world that seems to hum with the vibration of a deep, rhythmic order. And then they left us with the silence. As the sun sets over the ruins of the lower town, casting long geometric shadows across the baked clay, we are left to ponder the limits of what archaeology can tell us. We can map the streets, we can measure the bricks, and we can analyze the silt of the ancient riverbeds. But the soul of the city remains just out of reach. We see the shell of a perfect society, a masterpiece of urban planning that stood for centuries, yet the voices that once filled these orderly streets are gone, leaving only the wind to whistle through the empty doorways of a civilization that knew how to build for eternity, but forgot to tell us why. If you were to stand in the center of a home in Mohenjo-Daro 4,000 years ago, the first thing you might notice is not the sound of the marketplace or the lowing of cattle, but the gentle, rhythmic trickle of water. In an era when most of the world's inhabitants were content to live beside open pits or trek miles to a muddy riverbank, the people of the Indus Valley were obsessed with the flow of liquid. They understood, perhaps better than any culture until the height of the Roman Empire, that the health of a city is measured by what it hides beneath its feet. They lived in a world of terracotta pipes and meticulously sloped drains, a subterranean network that mirrored the orderly streets above. To walk through these ruins today is to realize that for these people, water was not merely a resource to be consumed. It was a force to be mastered, guided, and perhaps even worshipped through the very act of washing it away. Nearly every home, from the modest dwellings of the artisans to the sprawling villas of the merchant elite, contained a private bathing area. These were not the dark, damp corners one might expect from the Bronze Age, but carefully paved rooms lined with fired bricks, polished smooth to the touch. The floors were angled with such precision that every drop of water would run toward a small opening in the wall leading out to the street. Here it would join a covered drainage system, a marvel of engineering that kept the city clean and the air remarkably fresh. There is a profound stillness in looking at these ancient drains, knowing that beneath the dust of 4 millennia, the logic of their design still holds true. They understood the gravity of things, the way a slight incline could carry away the impurities of a day's labor, leaving the home a sanctuary of quiet order. As we trace the path of these ancient pipes, we find ourselves drawn toward the heart of the city, where the most enigmatic structure of the Indus civilization sits in silent majesty. This is the great bath of Mohenjo-Daro. It is not a palace, nor is it a tomb, yet it occupies the most prominent position on the high citadel. Imagine a vast rectangular pool, nearly 40 feet long and 8 feet deep, sunken into the earth and surrounded by a colonnaded courtyard. The craftsmanship here is breathtaking. The bricks are joined with gypsum mortar and sealed with a thick layer of natural bitumen, a dark, tar-like substance, to ensure that not a single drop of water could leak through the walls. It is a watertight vessel of immense proportions, a temple of immersion, where the only deity was the water itself. We can almost hear the soft echo of footsteps on the brick stairs that lead down into the depths of the pool. In the cool of the morning, before the heat of the Indus sun began to bake the mud brick walls, the elite of the city may have gathered here for ritual purification. There is no evidence of blood sacrifice or the worship of terrifying gods in these ruins, leading many to believe that their spiritual lives were centered on the concept of cleanliness. To be pure was to be washed. To be holy was to be in harmony with the flow of the river. Perhaps they believed that water carried away more than just physical dirt. Perhaps it washed away the burdens of the spirit, leaving the mind as clear as the pools they built with such devotion. The management of water defined every rhythm of their existence. While other civilizations built towering pyramids or massive stone walls to keep out invaders, the Indus people built wells, thousands of them, deep, brick-lined shafts that reached down into the cool darkness of the water table, providing a constant, reliable source of life that did not depend on the whims of the seasonal rains. This was a society that valued stability over spectacle. Their luxury was not found in gold or jewels, though they had those in abundance, but in the quiet convenience of a well just outside the door and a drain that never clogged. It was a civilization of engineers and hydrologists, people who looked at a river and saw a complex system of pressures and flows rather than a temperamental god. And yet, there is a haunting quality to this obsession with hygiene. In the meticulously planned gutters and the standardized sizes of the bricks, we see a culture that demanded total control over its environment. They sought to tame the wild, silty waters of the Indus and bring them into the very heart of their bedrooms. They created a world where the messiness of nature was filtered through terracotta and brick, where the boundary between the wild river and the civilized home was absolute. One wonders if this quest for purity became a burden as the centuries wore on, if the maintenance of such a complex system required a level of social discipline that eventually became too much to bear. As the years passed, the relationship between the people and their water began to shift. We see it in the later layers of the soil, where the drains are no longer maintained with the same care, where the once perfect slopes begin to fail, and the pipes become choked with the debris of a fading world. The great bath, once the shining centre of the citadel, eventually fell into disuse, its bitumen seal cracking under the weight of time. The water that had once been their greatest servant was becoming a stranger. The rivers were changing their courses, the monsoons were becoming unpredictable, and the delicate balance of the urban oasis was beginning to tilt. But for 1,000 years, the Indus cities stood as a testament to what humanity can achieve when it stops fighting against the elements and begins to channel them. They lived in a state of constant, quiet washing, a perpetual cleansing that kept the chaos of the world at bay. Even now, as we look at the empty basins and the dry channels of Mohenjo-Daro, we can feel the ghost of that moisture, the phantom coolness of a brick floor wet from a morning bath, the distant sound of a bucket being lowered into a deep well, and the silent, invisible movement of a city's waste being carried away into the dark earth. It was a masterpiece of hidden labor, a civilization that found its voice in the soft, steady hum of water moving through the dark, ensuring that for a few golden centuries the world was clean, the streets were dry, and the soul was at peace. If you were to reach down into the sifted dust of a trench at Mohenjo-Daro, your fingers might brush against something small, cold, and remarkably smooth. It is a tiny square of steatite, a soft soapstone that hardens after being fired in a kiln, no larger than a modern postage stamp. At first, it feels like a mere pebble, worn by the passage of 4,000 years, but as you wipe away the silt of the Indus Valley, a world of sharp lines and haunting imagery begins to emerge. This is the seal, the most intimate and enduring relic of a people who mastered the art of the miniature. To hold one is to feel a direct, tactile connection to a hand that moved in the Bronze Age, a hand that carved these microscopic details with a precision that defies the simplicity of their tools. On the face of these seals, we find a silent procession of the living and the mythical. There are heavy-set bulls with dewlaps that fold like velvet, their horns curved in elegant, lethal arcs. There are elephants, rendered with such anatomical care that you can almost see the wrinkled texture of their skin and the intelligent weight of their gaze. Sometimes a rhinoceros appears, plated in its natural armor, or a tiger, coiled with a tension that has remained taut for 40 centuries. But most frequent, and perhaps most mysterious, is a creature that appears to be a unicorn, a slender, one-horned beast standing before what looks like a ritual brazier or a feeding trough. It is a creature born of the imagination, yet carved with the same realism as the water buffalo, suggesting that to the Indus mind, the line between the observed world and the spirit world was perhaps thinner than we can ever truly know. Above these animals, marching across the top of the stone square, is the reason these objects haunt the sleep of modern linguists. It is a row of symbols, a fish with a line through it, a pair of upright lances, a shape resembling a human figure carrying a yoke. This is the Indus script. It is a language that has been seen by millions of eyes, but read by none in the modern era. There are no bilingual inscriptions here, no Rosetta Stone to bridge the gap between their lost tongue and our own. We see the characters, we count their frequency, we map their patterns, and yet they remain as silent as the stone they are etched upon. They are the voices of a ghost civilization, frozen in a gesture of communication that has been interrupted by the long, heavy veil of time. As you turn the seal over in your hand, you notice a small boss or a perforated hump on the back. It was designed to be threaded with a cord, perhaps worn around the neck or tied to a wrist. This suggests that these were not merely beautiful trinkets, but functional tools of a complex, bureaucratic society. We imagine a merchant standing on a crowded wharf near the mouth of the river, the air thick with the smell of drying fish and cedar wood. He has a shipment of cotton textiles or beads of carnelian destined for the distant markets of Mesopotamia. To secure his cargo, he presses a hunk of wet, grey clay over the knot of a rope or the rim of a jar. Then, with a firm, practiced motion, he presses his stone seal into the soft mud. The sensation is easy to visualize, the resistance of the clay giving way to the hard stone, the intricate carvings leaving their negative impression in the earth. When he pulls the seal away, the wet clay now bears his mark, the unicorn and the silent script. It is an act of identification, a claim of ownership, and a promise of quality. It is a signature that can travel hundreds of miles, surviving the jolts of a bullock cart and the spray of the Arabian Sea, telling anyone who sees it exactly who sent this vessel and what authority stands behind it. In this small act of pressing stone into clay, we see the birth of the individual in the eyes of the state, a person whose name or title was recognized by a system of laws and trade that stretched across thousands of square miles. Yet there is a deeper, more atmospheric possibility that lingers around these objects. Some archaeologists wonder if the seals were more than just merchant IDs. Perhaps they were amulets, infused with a protective power. The animals depicted, the powerful bull, the fierce tiger, the enigmatic unicorn, might have been clan totems or guardian spirits. To wear a seal might have been to carry the protection of one's ancestors or the blessing of a hidden god. When we look at the script atop the seals, we are looking at a code that likely contained names, but might also have held prayers, or titles of office, or even short, pithy mantras that have since evaporated into the dry desert air. The mystery deepens when we consider the sheer consistency of these items. From the northern foothills of the Himalayas to the salty marshes of the coast, the seals remain remarkably similar in style and execution. For hundreds of years, the script did not seem to evolve or drift into different dialects. The animals remained posed in the same iconic stances. This suggests a powerful centralized influence, a guild of scribes or a school of engravers who maintained a rigid standard of excellence. It speaks of a society that valued order and continuity above all else, where the way a letter was carved in one century was exactly how it was carved in the next. Meanwhile, the script itself remains a tantalizing puzzle of about 400 unique signs. It is too complex to be a simple alphabet, yet too concise to be a purely pictographic system like early Egyptian hieroglyphs. It likely sits in that middle ground known as logosyllabic, where some signs represent whole words and others represent sounds. We see the script on seals, on copper tablets, and even on shards of broken pottery, but we never find it on long scrolls or monumental stone stelae. There are no epic poems carved into the city walls, no long lists of conquering kings, no boasts of bloody victories. The Indus people used their writing for the small, the practical, and the personal. This absence of grand history in their writing is perhaps the most striking thing about them. While the pharaohs of Egypt were carving their names in giant stone letters to ensure immortality, the people of the Indus were pressing their identities into small bits of clay to ensure that a trade deal was honest. Theirs was a literacy of the everyday, a voice that spoke of grain and oil and cloth, rather than the egos of emperors. And so, when the civilization eventually began to fade, their writing faded with it. Because it was tied to the living breath of commerce and daily ritual, rather than the cold permanence of a tomb wall, it vanished when the markets emptied and the rituals changed. We are left then with the tactile memory of the stone. If you were to close your eyes and imagine the city at dusk, you might hear the soft, rhythmic tapping of a copper chisel against a piece of steatite. You would see the artisan working by the light of an oil lamp, his eyes strained as he carves a line no thicker than a human hair. He is not just making a tool, he is capturing a fragment of his world's soul. When he finishes, he will fire the stone until it turns a creamy, ghostly white, a color that stands out against the dark earth. As the centuries piled up, layer upon layer, these seals were lost in the floors of houses, dropped in the streets, or tucked into the belts of the dead. They waited in the suffocating silence of the soil, holding their secrets tight. Today, when we look at a seal featuring a lone elephant and a string of 5 unknown characters, we are standing on the edge of a great canyon of time. We can see the other side, we can see the person who made it, we can feel the shape of their world, but we cannot hear what they are trying to tell us. The script remains a bridge that was built halfway across the water, leaving us to wonder what stories, what names, and what lost wisdom were meant to cross over into our time. The seals are the keys to a door that has no keyhole, leaving us to simply marvel at the craftsmanship of the lock. To hold a square of steatite in one's hand is to touch a silent conversation. For over a century, since the first seals were pulled from the dust of Harappa, scholars have stared into these tiny, carved faces of bulls and unicorns, waiting for the symbols above them to speak. We know the voices of the Nile because of the basalt slab found in the sands of Rosetta, where the same decree was carved in 3 different tongues, allowing the modern mind to leap across the chasm of time. We know the Epic of Gilgamesh because the wedge-shaped marks of Mesopotamia were etched onto clay in multiple languages, providing a bilingual map for the curious. But here, in the valley of the Indus, there is no Rosetta Stone. There is no royal proclamation carved into a cliffside in both an old language and a new one. There is only the silence of the signs, standing alone, as they have for 4,000 years. The mystery begins with the sheer brevity of the inscriptions. Most of these sequences are hauntingly short, averaging only 5 or 6 characters in length. The longest ever found contains only 26 signs, a mere whisper compared to the sprawling chronicles of the Pharaohs or the detailed ledgers of the Sumerian accountants. When we look at the corpus of what has been recovered, we see between 400 and 600 distinct signs. This number is a riddle in itself. It is too many characters for an alphabet, where each sign represents a single sound like our own. It is too few characters for a true logographic system like Chinese, where thousands of symbols are needed to represent every unique word and concept. Instead, it seems to sit in a strange middle ground, perhaps a logosyllabic system where some signs represent words and others represent the sounds of syllables, weaving together a complex tapestry of meaning that we simply cannot unpick. As the years passed, statistical analysis became our only lantern in this dark cave. By feeding these sequences into computers, researchers have looked for patterns in the way the symbols are ordered. They have found that the script has a clear directionality, almost certainly read from right to left, and that it possesses a definite structure, a kind of internal logic that suggests it is not merely a collection of random icons. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end to these short strings of symbols. Certain signs appear frequently at the start of a seal, while others are reserved strictly for the conclusion. This mathematical regularity has led many to believe that we are indeed looking at a true language, a lost tongue that once echoed through the brick-lined streets of Mohenjo-Daro, used to name kings, to label trade goods, or to invoke the protection of forgotten gods. Yet there is a persistent, quiet doubt that lingers in the halls of archaeology. A debate has simmered for decades. What if these signs are not a language at all? Some suggest they might be a system of non-linguistic symbols, perhaps something closer to heraldry, or a complex set of religious icons. In this view, a seal might not say, "This belongs to the merchant named Sargon," but might instead display a series of emblems representing a family lineage, a specific guild, or a blessing for a safe journey across the sea. If this is the case, the signs may never be read in the way we read a book. They would be more like a coat of arms, a visual shorthand that conveyed immense meaning to those within the culture, but which carries no phonetic value that can be translated into spoken words. Imagine the frustration of the linguist standing before a wall of 4,000 inscribed objects, knowing that the key to an entire civilization is right before their eyes, yet remains invisible. We have tried every trick of the trade. We have compared the signs to the Dravidian languages of southern India, searching for a phonetic bridge. We have looked at the Munda languages and even the distant ancestors of Sanskrit, hoping to find a familiar rhythm in the placement of the signs. Some have even tried to find links to the Rongorongo script of Easter Island or the ancient Elamite of Iran, stretching the threads of connection across oceans and mountains. But each time a scholar claims to have cracked the code, the consensus eventually dissolves. The evidence is simply too thin, the samples too short, the silence too deep. The materials themselves tell a story of a world that valued the portable and the personal. Most of the script is found on those small square seals, but we also find it on copper tablets, on pottery shards, and even on a massive wooden board found at Dolavira, which once held 10 large signs made of white gypsum. This signboard may have once hung above a city gate, a silent greeting to travellers arriving from the desert or the sea. But what did it say? Was it the name of the city? A royal welcome? A list of laws? As the sun sets over the ruins today, the gypsum is gone, and only the impressions remain, a ghostly reminder that the Indus people lived in a world saturated with information that we can see but cannot perceive. And so, we are left to wonder about the nature of a society that writes so much but says so little to the future. In Mesopotamia, writing began as a way to track debts and grain shipments, a cold, hard necessity of urban life. Perhaps the Indus script served a similar purpose, acting as a sophisticated system of branding for a civilization built on the movement of goods. When a merchant in the Persian Gulf broke the clay seal on a bundle of cotton from the Indus Valley, they didn't need to read the script to know where it came from. The symbols were a mark of origin, a guarantee of quality, a voice of authority that transcended the need for a shared spoken tongue. Meanwhile, the mystery of the script's disappearance is as profound as its origin. When the great cities began to decline around 1900, before the Common Era, the script did not evolve or migrate. It did not transform into a simpler form for the next generation. It simply vanished. As the people moved away from the drying rivers and the crumbling brick walls, they seemed to have laid down their styluses and forgotten the signs. It is as if a collective amnesia swept through the valley. The knowledge of how to carve these symbols and what they meant was buried under the silt of the changing landscape. For nearly 2,000 years, the Indian subcontinent would remain largely illiterate until the Brahmi script emerged in a completely different form, leaving the Indus signs as an isolated island in the stream of human history. This wall of silence creates a strange, haunting intimacy with the people of the Indus. Because we cannot read their names or their histories, we are forced to look at them through their hands rather than their words. We see them in the precision of their weights, the straightness of their streets, and the playful curves of their terracotta toys. We see a people who were orderly, artistic, and deeply connected to the natural world, yet they remain nameless. We cannot call out to them across the centuries because we do not know what they called themselves. They are a civilization of shadows, moving through perfectly planned cities, leaving behind 1,000 locked diaries and no key. As we contemplate these 400 signs, we must accept the possibility that they may never be deciphered, unless a bilingual text is found in the ruins of some ancient trading post, perhaps a clay tablet where a bored merchant scribbled a translation between cuneiform and the Indus script. The voice of this world may remain forever out of reach, but perhaps there is a certain beauty in this silence. It allows the Indus civilization to exist in our minds as a pure expression of human ingenuity, untainted by the biases of recorded history. They are not defined by the boasts of kings or the grievances of tax collectors. Instead, they remain a mystery, a profound reminder that even the greatest of human achievements can be swallowed by time, leaving only a few carved stones to whisper to the wind. Imagine for a moment a scholar sitting in a quiet room, surrounded by fragments of clay and stone that have been pulled from the earth after 4,000 years of sleep. The air is still, the only sound the soft scratching of a pencil against paper as they attempt to map the frequency of symbols that refuse to speak. This is the quiet, painstaking work of chasing a ghost language, a pursuit that feels less like science and more like a séance with the distant past. For decades, the search for the tongue of the Indus has centered on a handful of competing theories, each attempting to bridge the gap between the silent ruins of the north and the living cultures of the modern world. One of the most enduring ideas is the Dravidian hypothesis, the belief that the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro spoke an ancestral form of the languages now found primarily in southern India, such as Tamil, Kannada, and Telugu. Proponents of this view look at the linguistic map of the subcontinent and see a puzzle piece that was moved long ago. They point to the Brahui language, a small island of Dravidian speech tucked away in the mountains of Balochistan, far from its relatives in the south. It is like a lingering echo, a linguistic fossil suggesting that before the great shifts of history, this entire vast landscape may have shared a common, ancient voice. In this light, the symbols on the seals are not alien. They are the grandparents of words still spoken today, hidden under layers of time and migration. And yet, as we move through the corridors of history, we encounter a different story, one that has sparked deep debate and controversy for over a century. This is the Indo-Aryan theory, which suggests that the language of the Indus was an early relative of Sanskrit, the sacred language of the Vedas. This idea brings us into the realm of the Aryan invasion, or Aryan migration, a concept that has been re-evaluated and argued over by generations of archaeologists and geneticists. For a long time it was believed that a new group of people arrived from the Central Asian steppes, bringing with them horses, chariots, and the foundations of Indo-European speech, eventually displacing the older culture. But the more we look at the soil, the more the story blurs. There is no clear evidence of a sudden, violent conquest, no charred layers of ash or piles of weapons that mark a definitive end. Instead, we see a slow, rhythmic blending of peoples and ideas. This makes the search for the script even more difficult. For if the language changed gradually, like a river shifting its course over centuries, where does one era end and the next begin? Meanwhile, in recent years, the hunt has moved from the dusty field site to the cold, logical world of the computer. Modern researchers are using computational linguistics to look for patterns that the human eye might miss. They feed thousands of inscriptions into algorithms, asking the machine to calculate the entropy of the script, a mathematical way of measuring how much information and structure is contained within a sequence of signs. If the signs were merely decorative, the entropy would be random, like a scattering of stars. If they were a simple list of names, the patterns would be rigid and repetitive. But the results from these digital probes suggest something far more complex. The Indus script carries the same statistical signatures as spoken language. It has a syntax, a set of rules, and a deliberate order. The computer confirms what the heart suspects. These marks are not art, but an organized system of thought, waiting for a key that has not yet been found. As we ponder these patterns, we must confront the primary obstacle that has defeated every would-be decipherer since the 19th century, the crushing brevity of the inscriptions themselves. In Egypt, the Rosetta Stone provided a massive bilingual key that allowed scholars to compare known Greek with unknown hieroglyphs. In Mesopotamia, the vast libraries of clay tablets gave researchers thousands of lines of text to cross-reference. But in the Indus Valley, we have no such luxury. The average inscription is only 5 signs long. The longest ever found contains only 26. These are not poems or histories or laws. They are snippets. They are more like postage stamps or digital usernames than books. Imagine trying to reconstruct the entire English language if the only evidence you had were a few hundred business cards and some grocery lists. You might learn the word for apple or manager, but you would never hear the music of the language. You would never know how they expressed love or fear, or the way the light hits the river at dusk. This brevity suggests a society that used writing for a very specific, perhaps very narrow purpose. Perhaps the script was a tool of the merchant class, a way to mark ownership, to certify the quality of grain, or to identify a specific family or guild. The seals, with their exquisite carvings of unicorns and elephants, were pressed into soft clay tags and attached to bundles of goods destined for the markets of Mesopotamia. In those distant lands, archaeologists have found Indus seals, thousands of miles from their home, lonely travelers that speak of a world already connected by trade and silver. But because the texts are so short, they lack the repetitive structure needed to break the code. There are no long lists of kings, no epic battles described in detail, no prayers to specific gods that we can identify by name. There is only the silence of the shorthand, a bureaucratic whisper that has outlasted the very empire it was meant to organize. And so, we are left to wonder if we are looking for the wrong thing. Perhaps the lost literature of the Indus was never written on stone or clay at all. In the humid heat of the Punjab and the Sindh, materials like palm leaf, birch bark and cloth would have rotted away within a few generations. It is entirely possible that while the merchants used stone seals for their trade, the poets and priests were recording a vast oral tradition or writing on delicate organic scrolls that the earth simply could not preserve. We may be looking at the skeleton of a civilization and grieving the loss of its skin and spirit, unaware that the most beautiful parts of their world were always meant to be ephemeral. The search continues, driven by the hope that somewhere, beneath a mound of unexcavated earth, lies a bilingual tablet, a Rosetta Stone of the East that will finally link the Indus signs to a language we can understand. Until that day, the script remains a mirror. When we look at it, we see our own theories, our own biases, and our own deep desire to find a connection with those who came before us. We see a people who were masters of the physical world, who built perfect drains and straight streets, but whose inner lives remain as unreachable as the stars. They are a reminder that for all our technology and all our cleverness, there are some things that time keeps for itself. The ghost language of the Indus continues to haunt the ruins, a soft rhythmic pulse beneath the soil, a story that is finished, yet remains forever unread. The salt-crusted deck of a reed boat creaks under the weight of 1,000 small wonders, swaying gently as it navigates the turquoise shallows of the Arabian Sea. It is a journey of nearly 1,500 miles, a slow and rhythmic passage guided by the stars and the seasonal breath of the monsoon winds. We are drifting away from the orderly brick quays of Lothal, leaving behind the precise geometry of the Indus, and turning our gaze toward the horizon where the sun dips into the Persian Gulf. This was the lifeline of the Bronze Age, a maritime highway that connected the world's first great urban experiments. While the script of the Indus remains a silent enigma, the physical traces of their travels are scattered across the sands of distant lands, like breadcrumbs left by a ghost. In the bustling marketplaces of ancient Mesopotamia, amidst the towering ziggurats of Ur and the crowded streets of Akkad, archaeologists have unearthed small square tokens of white steatite. These are the Indus seals, unmistakable markers of a people from the East, found resting in the debris of a civilization that spoke an entirely different tongue. To hold one of these seals is to feel the weight of a transaction made 4,000 years ago. They were not merely art, they were the signatures of a sprawling mercantile empire. When a merchant in the Indus Valley packed a bale of cotton or a jar of grain, he would press his unique seal into a lump of wet clay over the binding. This clay, known as a bulla, served as a tamper-evident lock. If the seal arrived unbroken in Mesopotamia, the buyer knew the cargo was pure and untouched. The presence of these seals in the heart of Sumer tells us that the Indus people were not isolated dreamers. They were the master venturers of their era. They were a people who looked at the vast, churning expanse of the ocean and saw not a barrier, but a bridge. As we follow these ancient sailors, we begin to hear the echoes of a name whispered in the cuneiform tablets of the kings of Akkad. They spoke of a land called Meluha. The texts describe great ships arriving from this distant realm, laden with treasures that seemed almost otherworldly to the people of the Tigris and Euphrates. King Sargon of Akkad boasted that the ships of Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun lay tied at the quay of his capital. While the location of Meluha was long a subject of scholarly debate, the evidence now points overwhelmingly to the Indus Valley. To the Mesopotamians, the Meluhans were the people of the Black Land, perhaps a reference to the dark silt of the Indus River, or the sun-darkened skin of the sailors who arrived with the tides. It is a haunting thought that while we cannot read the words the Indus people wrote about themselves, we can read what their neighbors wrote about them, a reflection of a shadow cast across the ancient world. The cargo of these ships was the very definition of luxury. Imagine the vibrant, sunset orange of carnelian beads, polished to a glass-like sheen using techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. These beads have been found in the royal tombs of Ur, draped around the necks of Sumerian queens, their long tubular shapes a testament to the incredible patience of the Indus craftsmen who drilled through the hard stone with delicate bronze bits. Along with the carnelian came the deep celestial blue of lapis lazuli, mined from the high, cold mountains of modern-day Afghanistan and brought down to the coastal ports to be shipped westward. There was ivory, carved from the tusks of elephants that once roamed the lush plains of the Punjab, and exotic woods, perhaps teak or ebony, that would be used to craft the furniture of Mesopotamian palaces. The trade was not a one-way street, though the evidence of what the Indus people took in return is more elusive. Perhaps they traded their crafts for silver, or for the wool and fragrant oils of the West, goods that have long since rotted away or been melted down, leaving no trace in the acidic soil. This creates a lopsided view of history, where we see the exports but can only guess at the imports. Yet the movement of these objects suggests a world that was far more interconnected than we often imagine. There was a shared language of commerce, a set of weights and measures that allowed a merchant from Mohenjo-Daro to trade fairly with a merchant from Babylon. The Indus people used a sophisticated system of stone cubes carved from chert, which followed a strict binary and decimal ratio. These weights are so precise that they barely vary across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. In the silence of the archaeological record, this precision speaks volumes. It tells of a society that valued order, fairness, and a meticulous attention to detail. As the ships moved between the ports of the Gulf, they likely stopped at the islands of Dilmun, known to us today as Bahrain. This was a middle ground, a place of freshwater springs amidst the salt sea, where merchants from different worlds could meet and exchange news. One can almost hear the soft murmur of many languages blending in the heat of the afternoon, the harsh glottals of Sumerian mixing with the rhythmic, unknown tongue of the Meluhans. They would have sat in the shade of palm trees, discussing the price of copper or the height of the coming floods, oblivious to the fact that one of their languages would be preserved in clay for eternity, while the other would vanish like mist. This maritime network required an immense knowledge of the natural world. The sailors had to understand the stratigraphy of the sea, the way the currents moved and the way the stars shifted with the seasons. They were masters of the monsoon, waiting for the winds to turn before beginning their long journey home. This was a slow life, measured in months and moon cycles. There was no hurry in the Bronze Age, only the steady, patient pulse of the waves against the hull. The ships themselves were likely made of bundled reeds or thick planks of cedar, coated in bitumen to keep out the brine. They were sturdy, humble vessels that carried the seeds of globalization. Deep time has a way of smoothing over the complexities of these lives, reducing a merchant's entire existence to a single seal found in a dusty trench. But we must imagine the human reality, the anxiety of a father waiting for his son to return from the western seas, the pride of a jeweler finishing a bead that would eventually travel thousands of miles, the curiosity of a Sumerian scribe looking at the strange script on an Indus seal and wondering what it meant. Did they try to learn each other's words? Were there translators who lived in the foreign quarters of these cities, acting as the bridge between two great silences? The Meluha of the Mesopotamian texts eventually fades from the record. As the centuries passed into the second millennium before the Common Era, the mentions of these distant Eastern traders become fewer and farther between. The great trade routes began to wither, perhaps due to shifting river courses or changes in the climate that made the long voyages too difficult to sustain. The ships stopped coming to the quays of Ur. The carnelian and the ivory became heirlooms rather than fresh imports. And as the connection was severed, the Indus civilization began to pull back into itself, moving away from the coast and toward the foothills of the Himalayas. The voice of Meluha, once a vibrant part of the global choir, grew quiet, leaving behind only the cold, hard evidence of their ambition. We are left to wander through the ruins of their ports, looking out at the same sea they once conquered, wondering how a people so connected to the world could leave so little of their story behind. The waves continue to lap at the shore, a timeless rhythm that once carried the wealth of empires, now whispering secrets to the sand that no one left alive can truly understand. In the quiet corridors of the mind, we often equate power with the shadow of a monument, imagining that every great turn of the human story must have been dictated by a single voice from a high throne. We look for the golden crown, the blood-stained spear, or the towering pyramid that screams of an individual's ego carved into the very skin of the earth. But as we walk the grid-laid streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, a different kind of silence meets us. A silence that challenges everything we think we know about how humans organize their lives. There are no grand palaces here. There are no sprawling estates where a sovereign might have looked down upon the masses, and no royal tombs filled with the sacrificed remains of servants and the glittering hoard of a lifetime's plunder. In Egypt, we find the Valley of the Kings. In Mesopotamia, the royal tombs of Ur. But in the Indus Valley, the dead seem to have slipped away with a strange, quiet equality. They were buried with modest pottery, a few beads of carnelian, and perhaps a copper mirror, items of utility and simple beauty that suggest a life well lived, rather than a status desperately defended beyond the grave. It is as if the very concept of a great man of history was alien to them, or perhaps something they had consciously decided to outgrow. we are left to grapple with the most famous face of this lost world, a small soapstone figure barely 7 inches tall, known to us as the Priest King. He sits with a trimmed beard and a headband, his robe decorated with trefoil patterns that once held red pigment. His eyes are narrowed in a gaze of eternal composure, looking out across 5,000 years with a serene, almost detached authority. For decades we have called him a king because we do not know what else to call a man who carries himself with such dignity. But the title is a fragile one, a projection of our own obsession with hierarchy. There is no evidence he ruled anything. He might have been a teacher, a magistrate, or simply a respected elder in a society that valued wisdom over conquest. When we look closer at the bones of these cities, we find something even more radical than the absence of a king. We find the overwhelming presence of a massive, thriving middle class. The houses are remarkably uniform, built with the same fire-baked bricks according to the same proportions, whether they sat in the heart of the city or on its dusty periphery. This was a civilization that seems to have been obsessed with the idea of enough. They did not build one massive temple to a distant god. Instead, they built thousands of clean, efficient homes with private bathrooms and sophisticated drainage systems that would not be seen again in the world for millennia. It is a landscape of domestic comfort rather than imperial vanity, a world where the collective well-being of the many seems to have outweighed the glorification of the few. To maintain such order across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years, there must have been a guiding hand, but it appears to have been a hand of ink and scale rather than one of iron and blood. Throughout the ruins, archaeologists have found thousands of small chert cubes, weights used for trade. What is staggering is their precision. From the smallest pebble to the largest block, they follow a strict binary and decimal system that remains consistent across the entire geography of the Indus. Whether you were a merchant in a coastal port or a farmer in the northern highlands, a gram was a gram, and a litre was a litre. This kind of standardization requires a deep, underlying trust, a social contract that functioned without the visible threat of a standing army. We might imagine, then, a governance not of monarchs, but of guilds, a corporate or council-based system where the city was managed like a vast, interlocking machine. Perhaps the true leaders were the master merchants, the architects, and the keepers of the grain, men and women who viewed leadership as a matter of logistics and public health rather than divine right. In this light, the Indus script, those elegant, undeciphered symbols, might not be the chronicles of wars or the lineages of kings, but the ledger lines of a peaceful bureaucracy, the quiet record-keeping of a society that found its strength in cooperation and the steady, rhythmic flow of commerce. As the evening mist rolls over the excavated brickwork, one cannot help but feel the weight of this forgotten alternative. We are so used to the story of history being written in the blood of the conquered, but here, in the dust of the Punjab, is a whisper of a different path. It is the story of a people who built the world's first planned cities not to honor a god or a tyrant, but to honor the simple, daily act of living together in harmony. They left no statues of conquerors because perhaps they found no glory in conquest. They left no palaces because the city itself was their palace. The mystery of their governance remains one of the great ifs of our past. Was it a utopia, or simply a very different kind of control? Without a Rosetta Stone to unlock their words, we are left to judge them by the things they left behind, the sturdy walls, the clean water, and the perfect unchanging weights. They remind us that power does not always have to be loud to be effective, and that sometimes the most sophisticated societies are the ones that leave the least for the archaeologists to find, because they spent their energy on the living rather than the dead. As we move through the silent streets, we see the shadows of people who were remarkably like us, yet fundamentally different in their priorities. They lived in a world where the individual was subsumed into the rhythm of the collective, where the beauty of a city lay in its function, and the strength of a culture lay in its predictability. It is a sobering thought to realize that such a stable, prosperous way of life could vanish so completely, leaving only these red clay bricks to tell a story of a peace that lasted 1,000 years. The wind blows through the empty doorways of Mohenjo-Daro, carrying the scent of dry earth and ancient rain. It is a long, slow breath from a time when the world was younger, a time when humanity was still experimenting with what it meant to live in groups of tens of thousands. We are the descendants of those experiments, yet we have lost the manual they wrote. We search for their voices in the dirt, hoping to find a clue that explains how they managed to thrive for so long without the crutches of empire. Perhaps the answer is hidden in the very thing we find so confusing, their lack of ego. In a world of kings and emperors, the Indus people chose to be a society of neighbors. They chose the scale over the sword and the sewer over the monument. And as we drift further into the history of this silent empire, we must ask ourselves if their disappearance was a failure of their system, or if they simply reached a point where they no longer needed the structures of the world they had built. The sun has long since set on their cities, and the scripts they carved into soapstone seals remain as silent as the stars. But in the precision of their streets and the equality of their homes, we find a message that transcends language. It is a message of order, of balance, and of a quiet, persistent dignity that does not require a crown to be recognized. We are left to wander these ruins in the dim light of our own understanding, listening for the echoes of a people who didn't need to shout to be heard across the ages. As the years passed and the rivers began to shift their courses, the foundations of this remarkably stable world began to tremble, not from the march of invading boots, but from the slow, inexorable changes of the earth itself. The very environment that had nurtured their rise began to withdraw its favor, and the society without kings found itself facing a challenge that no amount of standardization could solve. We look now toward the fading horizon of their era, wondering how a people so grounded in the practicalities of life handled the slow realization that their world was coming to an end. The silence of the Indus is not just the silence of a lost language. It is the silence of a civilization that may have simply walked away, leaving their perfect cities to the dust, having found that the true measure of a life is not what is left behind, but how we treat one another while we are here. The heavy, rusted scent of wet earth after a monsoon rain often brings to mind the permanence of the ground beneath our feet. Yet in the valley of the Indus, the soil tells a story of what is missing as much as what remains. When we look at the ruins of other great Bronze Age powers, the sun-drenched sands of Egypt or the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia, the stones cry out with the clamor of war. We see granite reliefs of kings trampling their enemies under chariot wheels, walls decorated with the counted hands of the fallen, and long, boastful inscriptions detailing the borders of empires won through fire and steel. But as we walk through the ghost streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, we find a curious, almost haunting vacancy. There are no murals of soldiers marching in phalanx. There are no basalt stelae commemorating a great general's victory. In the thousands of artifacts recovered from these mounds, we find a profound absence of the imagery of conquest, a civilization that seems to have looked at the world and decided that the art of living was more vital than the art of killing. It is a mystery that challenges our modern understanding of how a complex society functions. We often assume that the rise of the city-state requires a professional class of warriors to defend its grain and its gold. Yet here, the archaeology whispers of a different path. While they certainly possessed tools of copper and bronze, knives, fishhooks, and arrowheads, these appear designed for the daily labor of survival and the hunt, rather than the systematic destruction of fellow men. The walls that surround their cities were not the jagged, defensive battlements of a people under siege, but were instead carefully engineered to hold back the rising floodwaters of the river. This lack of martial obsession allows us to see the Indus people not as conquerors, but as creators, whose aesthetic energy was poured into the intimate, the beautiful, and the domestic. Perhaps the most iconic evidence of this refined spirit is a small, dark figure no larger than the palm of a hand, known to us now as the Dancing Girl. Cast in bronze over 4,000 years ago, she stands with a relaxed, almost defiant grace, one hand resting on her hip, her head tilted back as if lost in a moment of music that only she can hear. She is not a goddess to be feared, or a queen to be obeyed, but a person captured in a moment of rhythmic expression. To create her, the artisans used a technique called cire perdu, or lost wax casting. This process involves sculpting a figure in wax, covering it in layers of clay, and then heating the mold so the wax melts away, leaving a hollow space to be filled with molten bronze. It is a sophisticated, multi-stage technology that requires patience and a deep understanding of metallurgy, yet they used it not to cast weapons of war, but to immortalize the curve of a young woman's arm and the heavy stack of bangles that adorns her skin. As we look closer at these bangles and the necklaces found in hidden hoards beneath the floors of their homes, we begin to see how identity was expressed in a world without words. They were masters of lapidary, the art of cutting and polishing stones. They favored the deep sunset red of carnelian, which they drilled with microscopic precision, using specialized stone bits to create long, elegant beads. These beads traveled thousands of miles across the sea to the markets of Ur and Kish, serving as a silent signature of Indus craftsmanship. A merchant wearing such a necklace was not just displaying wealth. He was wearing a piece of his culture's soul, a testament to a society that valued the slow, meditative work of the artisan over the swift violence of the soldier. Meanwhile, the fashion of the time suggests a people who took great pride in their appearance, with figurines showing elaborate hairstyles, woven textiles, and jewelry that draped across the chest in intricate patterns, suggesting that even in a world of standardized bricks and planned streets, there was a vibrant, pulsing need for individual beauty. This softness of spirit extends even into the nurseries of these ancient homes. In the dust of the streets, archaeologists have found a wealth of terracotta objects that were never meant for ritual or trade. They are toys. There are small clay carts with wheels that actually turn, designed to be pulled by a string, perhaps by a child mimicking the great ox carts that rumbled past their door. There are whistles shaped like birds that still produce a haunting, warbling note when blown, and tiny monkeys that can slide down a string, their clay limbs frozen in a playful descent. There are even hollow clay balls filled with small pebbles to serve as rattles for infants. These objects, so simple and so fragile, provide a window into a nurturing domestic life that is often lost in the grand narratives of history. They suggest a people who had the leisure and the inclination to provide for the happiness of their children, a society where the sound of a bird whistle was more common than the clash of shields. And so, we are left to wonder about the nature of power in a land without kings or commanders. If there were no grand palaces or massive tombs to house the egos of the elite, perhaps their pride was invested in the collective. Their art was not a tool of propaganda, but a celebration of the everyday. The figurines we find, the humped bulls with their powerful shoulders, the small dogs with curled tails, the mother goddesses with their elaborate fan-shaped headdresses, all speak to a deep connection with the natural world and the cycles of life. They lived in a world where the boundary between the sacred and the mundane was thin, where a well-carved seal or a perfectly fired toy was an act of devotion in itself. As the centuries drifted by and the climate began to shift, The lack of a warrior culture may have been a choice rather than an oversight. In a land defined by the unpredictable flow of the river and the steady rhythm of the seasons, perhaps they understood that the greatest enemy was not a neighboring tribe, but the slow, inevitable change of the earth itself. They built their world on cooperation and craft, leaving behind a legacy of beauty that does not require a translation to be understood. When we hold a carnelian bead or look into the eyes of a terracotta figurine, we are touching a peace that lasted for over 1,000 years, a silence that is not empty, but filled with the echoes of a people who chose the quiet artistry of the hearth over the loud, fleeting glory of the sword. Consider for a moment the scent of wet earth after a long, parched summer, that heavy, sweet fragrance of the petrichor as the first droplets of the monsoon strike the sun-baked silt of the plains. In the 3rd millennium before our era, this scent was the herald of life itself, a signal that the great rhythms of the cosmos were once again in alignment. The Indus Valley was not merely a collection of brick and mortar, but a living, breathing landscape defined by the shifting whims of 2 gargantuan river systems. To understand the silence of their script, we must first understand the song of their waters, a melody played out across the vast alluvial plains that stretched toward the horizon, fertile and forgiving, yet inherently unstable. The survival of these ancient people was a delicate dance with the seasons, dictated by the arrival of the summer monsoons. These heavy rains, sweeping across the Indian subcontinent, would swell the mountain streams of the Himalayas, sending a surge of nutrient-rich sediment down into the valley. As the rivers overflowed their banks, they deposited a layer of fine, silty earth, a natural fertilizer that required no heavy ploughing to yield its treasures. This was the gift of the gods, a predictable cycle that allowed for a surplus of food, which in turn allowed for the luxury of specialized labor, the building of granaries, and the eventual birth of the world's first truly planned urban centers. But this abundance was tied to a geography that no longer looks as it did 5,000 years ago. While the Indus River remains a powerful presence today, there is a ghost that haunts the maps of the ancient world, a phantom waterway known in the oldest Vedic hymns as the Saraswati. For decades, archaeologists and geologists have traced the dry, ancient channels of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, searching for the remains of a river that once flowed with the same majesty as the Indus. In the deep time of the Bronze Age, this lost river may have been the true heart of the civilization, with over 2/3 of the known settlement sites clustered not along the Indus, but along this now desolate path of sand and scrub. We look upon these ruins today and see a desert, but if we could peel back the layers of stratigraphy, that chronological layering of Earth that serves as the planet's diary, we would find the remains of lush marshlands and vibrant riverbanks where the Saraswati once flowed. The disappearance of this river remains one of the great geological mysteries of the ancient world. Some believe that tectonic shifts, the literal grinding of the Earth's crust, diverted the tributaries that fed the Saraswati, forcing its waters into the Ganges or the Yamuna and leaving a once thriving valley to wither into a graveyard of dust. Others point to a slow, agonizing change in the climate, a weakening of the monsoon patterns that had sustained the region for millennia. As the rains failed to arrive with their usual vigor, the great river began to fragment, breaking into a series of stagnant lakes before vanishing entirely into the Thar Desert. It is a sobering reflection on the fragility of even the greatest empires, that a shift in the tilt of the earth or a change in the wind could erase the lifeblood of 1 million people. And yet, before the waters receded, the people of the Indus displayed a level of agricultural ingenuity that was far ahead of its time. They were perhaps the first in the world to master the art of multicropping, a sophisticated system of planting different seeds to take advantage of both the winter and summer seasons. In the cooler months, they sowed wheat and barley, harvesting them as the heat began to rise. Then, as the monsoons arrived, they planted legumes and millets that thrived in the humidity. This dual harvest provided a safety net against the failure of any single crop, a testament to a culture that valued stability and foresight over the reckless expansion of territory. Perhaps their most beautiful contribution to the fabric of human history was the domestication of cotton. Long before the looms of Egypt or the silk walks of China became legendary, the people of the Indus were growing the soft, white fibers of the gossypium plant. They learned to spin and weave this tree wool, as later travelers would call it, into light, breathable fabrics perfectly suited for the sweltering heat of the plains. We can imagine the bustling marketplaces of Mohenjo-Daro filled with the sight of dyed textiles, vibrant reds from the madder root and deep blues from indigo, colors that have long since faded into the grey of the earth, yet remain as a ghost in the archaeological record. The rivers provided more than just food and clothing. They were the superhighways of the ancient world. Flat-bottomed boats, much like the ones still used by local fishermen today, glided along the currents, carrying timber from the mountains, copper from the hills, and precious stones from the distant reaches of the coast. This connectivity was the glue that held the civilization together, allowing a person in a small village to share the same weights, the same measurements, and perhaps the same beliefs as a merchant in a city hundreds of miles away. It was a world bound by water, a civilization defined by the flow of the current. But the very rivers that gave life also held the seeds of the end. The Indus is a restless river, prone to avulsion, the sudden violent abandonment of its channel in favor of a new path across the flat plain. A city that sat on the banks of a river one year might find itself miles away from the water the next, or worse, buried under feet of suffocating silt during a catastrophic flood. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro have revealed thick layers of alluvial clay deep within the city's foundations, suggesting that the inhabitants were forced to rebuild their homes time and time again, raising the level of their streets to stay above the rising tide of the earth. As the centuries wore on, the balance began to tip. The geological disappearance of the Saraswati and the erratic behavior of the Indus created a landscape of uncertainty. The people began to move, migrating away from the great urban centers toward the smaller, more sustainable villages of the east and south. There was no single moment of collapse, no grand battle or burning of gates, only a quiet, gradual retreat as the environment that had nurtured them for 1400 years became increasingly inhospitable. The rivers, which had once been the stage for their greatest triumphs, became the silent witnesses to their departure. We are left to wonder if the script they left behind, those tantalizing symbols carved into soapstone, contained prayers for the rain to return, or perhaps records of the changing tides. Without a key to their language, we can only look at the dried riverbeds and the empty granaries and feel the weight of their loss. It is a story written in the soil and the silt, a narrative of a people who lived in harmony with the great cycles of the earth until those cycles changed, leaving their voices to be carried away by the wind over the sands where a mighty river once flowed. The silence of the Indus is not just a lack of words. It is the sound of a world that returned to the earth, waiting for us to listen to the story told by the stones and the shadows of the lost Saraswati. A single cracked brick lies at the bottom of a dry trench, its edges softened by 4,000 years of patient earth. Yet its proportions remain a perfect ghost of a forgotten law. For centuries, every brick across 1,000,000 square miles followed the same mathematical ratio of 4 to 2 to 1, a silent testament to a central authority that didn't need a face to be felt. But as we move upward through the layers of soil, through the stratigraphy, the vertical timeline of the Earth's memory, that perfect geometry begins to falter. The bricks become irregular, salvaged from older ruins or baked with less care, as if the invisible hand that once held the civilization together had begun to tremble. This was not a sudden fall, not a dramatic conquest of fire and sword, but a slow twilight, a long, quiet exhale that lasted for generations. The rhythm of life in the Indus Valley was always dictated by the pulse of the water, but around 1900, before the Common Era, the pulse began to skip. The great monsoons, those seasonal giants that carry the lifeblood of South Asia on their backs, began to shift their tracks. The rains that once turned the plains into a lush emerald cradle grew erratic and thin. As the climate cooled and the moisture failed, the very foundations of the world began to move. Deep beneath the crust, the restless plates of the earth shifted in a slow, tectonic dance, tilting the landscape just enough to alter the destiny of rivers. The Gaga-Hakra system, which many believe was the legendary Saraswati, began to lose its way. Its tributaries were captured by other giants, the Indus to the west and the Ganges to the east, leaving the once mighty channel to wither into a series of seasonal lakes and, eventually, a ghost of sand. Imagine standing on the walls of Mohenjo-Daro as the horizon changed. The river, which had always been a constant neighbour, a provider of silt and a highway for cedar wood boats, was receding. The docks that once buzzed with the languages of distant Meluha and Suma now looked out over widening mudflats. Without the predictable floods to renew the soil, the surplus of grain, the very energy that fueled the cities, began to vanish. And so the great de-urbanization began. It was a migration of the spirit as much as the body. The people did not disappear, they simply changed their minds about what it meant to live well. They began to look toward the east and the south, toward the greener fringes of the Ganges plain and the humid forests of the Deccan, where the rains were still kind. As the population thinned, the sophisticated machinery of the city began to rust in place. The famous drainage systems, those marvels of terracotta pipes and corbelled arches that kept the streets pristine, fell into disrepair. In the later layers of the archaeological record, we see the tragic sight of waste pits dug directly into the middle of once grand boulevards. The civic pride that had maintained the world's first sewage system for 700 years was replaced by the immediate, desperate needs of the present. The great granaries stood empty, their timber superstructures likely reclaimed for firewood or left to rot under a sun that had grown increasingly harsh. The standardization that defined the Indus, the uniform weights, the precise seals, the very script itself, began to dissolve into 1,000 local variations. The script, that elegant collection of unicorns and fish and mysterious grids, was perhaps the first thing to go. Writing is a tool of the complex, a language of the merchant, the tax collector, and the long-distance traveller. As the trade routes to Mesopotamia withered and the grand markets fell silent, the need for such a specialized code evaporated. The knowledge of how to read those signs likely lingered for a few generations in the minds of elderly scribes, but without a city to serve, their art became a relic. It is a haunting thought that there was a final person who could read the Indus script, an old soul living in a small thatched village, watching the kids play in the dirt, carrying the entire history and literature of a civilization in their head, with no one left to teach. The transition was so gradual that those living through it might not have realized they were witnessing the end of an era. To them, it was simply a series of hard winters, a succession of dry summers, and the pragmatic choice to move closer to a reliable spring. They traded their stone palaces for huts of wattle and daub, their inscribed seals for simple clay beads. The high culture of the Indus didn't die so much as it diluted, spreading out like a river reaching a delta, losing its force but nourishing a much wider area. The Harappan identity was replaced by a patchwork of local cultures, the cemetery H culture, the copper hoard culture. each a fragment of the former whole, yet each uniquely adapted to a more precarious world. Radiocarbon dating, our method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pin a moment in time, tells us that by 1700, before the Common Era, the great centres were largely shadows of their former selves. The silence had moved in. The wind began to pile sand against the baked brick walls, and the scrub brush of the Thar Desert started its long trek across the plazas. There was no one left to sweep the stairs of the great bath, no one to oil the wheels of the ox carts, no one to wonder why the rivers had betrayed them. The cities were not forgotten so much as they were let go, released back into the custody of the earth. In this slow twilight, we find a profound lesson in the fragility of our own built environments. We often think of collapses as thunderous events, but the Indus teaches us that a civilization can simply melt away, turning from a roar to a whisper over the course of a few centuries. The tectonic shifts and the weakening monsoons were the catalysts, but the true end was the breakdown of the invisible social contract, the shared belief in the grid, the weight, and the word. As the people drifted away into the haze of the shifting landscape, they carried with them certain memories, perhaps a way of planting or a style of pottery, but they left the script behind, buried in the silt of a river that no longer had a name. And so, the silence deepened. The mounds of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa became mere hills in the eyes of the local farmers, places where the ghosts of the ancients were said to dwell, but whose names had been erased by the wind. The script remained locked in the earth, etched onto small soapstone squares, waiting for a future that would not arrive for nearly 4,000 years. It is a story of a world that returned to the soil, not in defeat, but in a quiet surrender to the changing rhythms of a planet that never stays still for long. The twilight of the cities was not the end of the people, but it was the end of their voice. A voice that we are only now, with our brushes and our lasers and our quiet patience, beginning to hear again in the rustle of the dry grass. The scent of damp earth after a long-awaited rain carries a memory that does not require an alphabet to understand. Even as the grand gateways of Mohenjo-Daro crumbled and the sophisticated drainage systems choked with the dust of centuries, the essence of that world did not simply evaporate into the ether. It settled. It seeped into the very foundations of the landscape, becoming a ghost that haunts the modern world in the most mundane and beautiful of ways. If one were to stand on a rural road in the Indus Valley today, the rhythmic creak of a wooden wheel might sound exactly as it did 5,000 years ago. The bullock cart, with its sturdy frame and particular axle design, remains a living artifact. A piece of technology so perfectly suited to this terrain that time itself found no reason to alter it. We see these same carts in the terracotta miniatures recovered from the deepest layers of the earth, toys perhaps, or votive offerings. Yet their proportions are identical to the ones still hauling grain through the golden fields of the Punjab. It is a strange and comforting thought that a farmer today might mend a wheel using the same geometry and the same logic as an ancestor whose name has been erased by the winds of the Holocene. As the great urban experiments faltered and the populations drifted toward the greener valleys of the Ganges or the coastal reaches of the south, they carried their treasures not just in their hands, but in their habits. The jewelry that adorns a bride in a modern village often mirrors the exquisite craftsmanship found in the hoard of a Harappan merchant. The carnelian beads, etched with delicate white patterns through a complex heating process, are still produced using techniques that have remained virtually unchanged since the Bronze Age. We find these stones in the ruins, polished by hands that have been dust for millennia, yet the aesthetic preference, the love for that specific deep red hue, and the weight of the stone against the skin has survived the rise and fall of every empire that followed. This continuity extends far beyond the tangible. When scientists look into the genetic tapestry of modern South Asia using the quiet precision of genomic mapping, they find the Indus people are not gone at all. Their DNA is a foundational thread in the vast, multicolored fabric of the subcontinent, a biological legacy that has flowed through hundreds of generations. They are the grandfathers and grandmothers of millions, their resilience encoded in the very cells of the people who now walk the streets of Karachi, Delhi, and Mumbai. The cities were abandoned, yes, but the life force that built them simply changed its shape, trading the rigid geometry of the brick for the fluid movement of a migrating people. And yet, a profound mystery lingers in the silence of the soil. While the shape of the cart and the shine of the bead endured, the script did not. It is one of history's most haunting puzzles. Why a culture would retain its architecture, its agriculture, and its art, yet allow its written language to slip away like water through cupped hands. Usually, when a civilization develops writing, it clings to it, for script is the ultimate tool of power and memory. But as the Indus cities transitioned into smaller, decentralized villages, the need for the seal and the ledger seems to have vanished. The script was perhaps too tied to the life of the marketplace, to the grand bureaucratories of the granaries and the long-distance trade with Mesopotamia. When the trade routes fell silent and the granaries stood empty, the symbols lost their utility. They became decorative, then abstract, and finally they were forgotten, leaving a gap in the record that no amount of archaeological digging has yet been able to bridge. There is a certain romantic melancholy in the image of these great centers being reclaimed by the environment. For centuries, the mounds of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were nothing more than strange hills in a flat landscape, whispered about by locals but ignored by the wider world. The desert sands, driven by the relentless monsoon winds, acted as a preservative shroud. The salt in the soil crept into the bricks, and the scrub brush took root in the courtyards where children once played. The cities did not burn in a great conflagration, nor were they levelled by a single invading army. Instead, they underwent a slow, rhythmic burial, a long sleep beneath the silt of the changing riverbeds. As we look at the stratigraphy, the layers of time stacked one upon the other like the pages of a book written in dirt. We see the transition from the vibrant, bustling urban heights to a quieter, more pastoral existence. The high-fired bricks give way to sun-dried mud, and the grand avenues narrow into winding paths. To the eyes of a modern observer, this might look like a collapse, a failure of progress. But perhaps, in the deep time of the earth, it was merely an adaptation. The people chose to live, even if it meant letting go of the dream of the city. They chose the survival of the kin group over the survival of the state. We are left to wonder about the stories that were told around the fires of those later, smaller settlements. Did they tell legends of the high walls and the great baths? Did they remember the names of the kings who were not kings, or the priests who were not priests? Or did the memory fade as quickly as the script, replaced by the immediate demands of the harvest and the herd? The soil holds the answers, but it gives them up slowly, grudgingly. One shard of pottery at a time, the legacy of the Indus is a quiet one, found in the way a woman braids her hair, the way a potter turns his wheel, and the way the water still flows through the ancient channels of the mind. It is a civilization that refused to die, choosing instead to become the very ground upon which the future would be built, waiting in the stillness for someone to look down and recognize the familiar pattern of a world that once was. There is a certain quiet dignity in a history that refuses to be spoken aloud. In our modern age, we are accustomed to the past being weaponized, to ancient texts being passed for political leverage, or to the names of long-dead kings being invoked to justify the boundaries of the present. But the Indus Valley remains remarkably, stubbornly immune to such things. Because we cannot read their words, we cannot recruit them into our modern grievances. They exist in a state of perpetual neutrality, a society of millions that left behind no manifestos, no declarations of war, and no lists of conquered enemies. There is a profound peace in this silence, a sense that their story belongs entirely to them, held in a vault that no key of ours has yet been able to turn. We often move through the world with the quiet arrogance of the living, assuming that because we have the tools to measure the stars and split the atom, we have also mastered the narrative of our own species. Yet the undeciphered script of the Indus acts as a mirror to our own insignificance, a reminder that the vast majority of human experience has already slipped through the fingers of time, leaving no more trace than the scent of rain on a dry road. For every city we excavate, there are likely a dozen more that have been ground into dust by the shifting paths of rivers. For every seal we find, millions of spoken words, prayers, jokes, lullabies, and arguments have vanished into the atmosphere of the past. To look upon these symbols is to practice a form of historical humility, acknowledging that we are standing on the shore of a vast ocean of forgetting, and we have only gathered a few interesting shells from the sand. The script remains the final locked door of the ancient world. It is the boundary line where our science meets its limit. We have employed the most sophisticated computers, the most brilliant cryptographers, and the most patient linguists, and yet the symbols remain as aloof as they were when they were first pulled from the earth a century ago. Perhaps there is a reason for this. Perhaps the Indus people, in their wisdom, built a world so balanced and so focused on the collective that their individual voices were never meant to be heard across the millennia. By keeping their secrets safe, the script protects the purity of their achievement. It prevents us from projecting our own failures onto them, or from finding the cracks in their social fabric that surely must have existed. As long as the script remains a mystery, the Indus Valley can remain a dream of what a human civilization might be, orderly, clean, peaceful, and remarkably free from the cult of the individual ruler. Among all the artifacts recovered from the silt and the salt, none captures this sense of enduring mystery quite like the seal of the so-called unicorn. Thousands of these small, square amulets have been found, carved with exquisite detail from soft steatite and fired to a glistening white. They depict a creature that looks like a magnificent bull, seen in profile so that its two horns appear as one, curving elegantly upward like a silver crescent moon. It stands before a strange tiered object that some call a ritual brazier or an incense burner, its eye wide and watchful, as if it is guarding the very threshold of the unknown. We call it a unicorn because we lack the vocabulary to call it by its true name, and in doing so, we have turned a functional administrative tool into a symbol of the ethereal. The unicorn seal is the emblem of the Indus, a creature that never existed, yet feels more real than the kings and emperors of other lands. It represents the allure of the unanswered. In a world where every corner of the globe is mapped by satellites and every historical mystery is dissected on a screen, the unicorn remains a ghost in the machine. It is a reminder that there are still things in this world that cannot be explained, and that some stories are better left to the imagination, where they can grow and breathe in the shadows of the long ago. As the years pass and the winds continue to scour the mounds of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the script does not fade, but its weight seems to grow. We realize that we are not just looking for a language, but for a way of being that we have forgotten. We look at the grid-patterned streets and the communal baths, and we wonder if the words they wrote were as orderly as their brickwork. Were their poems as precise as their weights and measures? Were their songs as rhythmic as the flow of water through their covered drains? We may never know if they spoke of love in the same way we do, or if they feared the dark in the same way we do. But in the absence of their voices, we are forced to listen to the silence they left behind, a silence that is not empty, but full of the presence of a people who are content to live, to build, and to vanish. leaving only a handful of beautiful, unreadable signs to tell us that they were here. The beauty of the unknown lies in its resistance to being finished. A book that is read can be put back on the shelf, but a script that cannot be read is a book that stays open forever. It invites us to return to it again and again, to run our fingers over the impressions in the clay and feel the ghost of the hand that pressed them there. It is a connection that transcends understanding. It is a bridge built of questions, stretching across 5,000 years of human history, reminding us that the most important parts of our journey are often the ones we cannot find the words to describe. And so, the Indus remains, a city of the mind, a civilization of shadows, and a voice that speaks most clearly when it says nothing at all. Imagine, if you will, the night sky as it appeared 5,000 years ago, arching over the brick ramparts of Mohenjo-Daro. The same stars we see tonight, yet somehow heavier, more intimate, undimmed by the electric glow of a modern world. To a merchant standing on a rooftop in the year 2500, before the Common Era, the constellation we call Orion might have been a celestial hunter, or perhaps a guardian of the celestial granary, watching over the wealth of the earth. Today, as the wind whistles through the excavated ruins of the lower town, those same stars look down upon a landscape of quiet dust and salt-encrusted clay. The silence that fills these streets now is not an empty thing. It is a presence, a thick and velvet layer of time that has settled over the hearths and the drains, the workshops and the temples. We often think of history as a straight line, a ladder leading upward toward progress. Yet standing here in the mind's eye, one feels the weight of the circle, the slow, rhythmic breathing of a planet that allows civilizations to bloom like desert flowers after a rare rain, only to gently pull them back into the soil when their season has passed. There is a profound humility in the realization that the Indus people did not fail in the way we often define failure. They simply finished their story. They were a people of exquisite order, a culture that found beauty in the precision of a right angle and the flow of clean water through a hidden pipe. They did not leave behind giant statues of kings or bloody accounts of conquest, but rather the evidence of a collective spirit that prioritized the common good, the steady rhythm of trade, and the sanctity of the bath. Theirs was a civilization of water, a life lived in a delicate dance with the great river, honoring its gifts and respecting its power until the climate shifted and the waters turned away. As the centuries drifted by, the bricks were reclaimed by the silt, the seals were buried beneath layers of sand, and the very memory of their language dissolved into the wind. We are left with the physical shell of their existence, a skeleton of a city that feels both alien and deeply familiar, for their concerns were ours, their hands shaped the same clay we touch, and their eyes sought the same comfort in the patterns of the night sky. The Indus River continues its long journey from the high, frozen peaks of the Himalayas, winding through the plains where the ghosts of Harappa still linger, moving with a slow and ancient grace toward the southern horizon. It carries with it the minerals of the mountains and the secrets of the vanished cities, flowing past the modern villages where life continues in a rhythm not so different from the one established 5 millennia ago. The river does not remember the names of the merchants or the sounds of the lost script. It simply flows, an eternal ribbon of blue and silver, cutting through the golden dust of the Sind. As the water finally meets the salt of the Arabian Sea, it dissolves into the vastness of the world's oceans, carrying the essence of the Indus into the global current. In this way, nothing is ever truly lost. The atoms of the city, the moisture of the ancient rains, and the very spirit of that ordered, peaceful world are still with us, circulating in the clouds and the tides. We may never decode the symbols on the soapstone seals, and the voices of the Indus may remain forever hushed, But perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a people who lived so harmoniously with the earth. They do not demand our recognition. They do not shout for our attention across the ages. Instead, they offer us a space for reflection, a quiet corner of history where we can contemplate the beauty of a well-made street and the dignity of a life lived in balance. As the images of the red brick ruins begin to fade into the soft darkness of sleep, we can almost hear the faint splash of water in a distant courtyard, the muffled sound of a potter's wheel turning in the afternoon heat, and the rustle of a silk robe as someone walks toward the river at dusk. The city is at peace now. The script is at rest, and the river continues its long, slow drift toward the eternal sea, carrying the silence of the Indus into the heart of the night.